All right, he had every reason to play it safe, and instead he took the risk that changed his entire life. Terry Borer, welcome to the Fox Den.
Hi, Nathan.
Thank you for joining us this morning. I wanted to sit down with you because you have a really unique and incredible story, and I'm happy to share it. I'm happy that you wanted to share it with my viewers.
No problem. Happy to be here.
For sure. So let's just dive right in. There is a movement out there called the FIRE movement, which stands for Financial Independence, Retire Early. And you are living this in your life. And I'm very curious to know how this idea was generated and how you have managed to retire at such a young age.
Sure. So maybe I'll first tell you a little bit about myself, and then I can answer that question. So right now I'm 48. I went to university in Toronto, a program called engineering science, but effectively I became a computer engineer. I did my master's there, and then I spent a couple decades at a semiconductor company. I got married, I had 4 kids, and then I retired at 46. Without the kids, I could certainly have retired sooner, but I wanted to give myself more margin to make sure that nothing went wrong. I first learned about the FIRE movement in my early 20s, and let me just share a window here, and I'll show you the book.
Sure.
So there's 2 books that I'll mention here. The first one I'm talking about is the one on the left, called Your Money or Your Life. So it's written by Joe Dominguez and Vicki Robin. Vicki Robin is still active, but Joe was a guy who was, a high-flying accountant with the corner office somewhere in South America, making lots of money. He decided to give it all up, retire early, and then travel. And sometime later, maybe 30 years after he did this, he died, and we were able to look at his life, and he was able to do exactly what he wanted. He traveled the whole time. As far as I could tell, he seemed very happy. And he had a lot that he could have kept working for and gotten richer and richer and chose not to. So this had an impact on me. And I decided that maybe I wouldn't retire early necessarily, but I wanted to have the option in order to do so. I felt like getting that extra bit of money was going to make a big difference for me in a few ways. First is that I've been told a number of times that any career you have is risky, it can end at any time. Your whatever field you're in could change dramatically, and I wanted to have some defense for that. The second is that I saw that what my dad did was he worked for, I think, 42 years or something. He graduated, he got an MBA, and then he worked until he was almost 65, and this was great, but I could see that that was maybe excessive. He had this idea that maybe he would make money and have something that he could give to his kids and make sure that we could have an easier life. And I said, well, if that was part of his purpose, I should probably do that, right? What's the point of his sacrifice if I'm just going to also go work until I'm 65? I was making enough money. I didn't have any issues with that. So that had some impact. And also, I kind of wanted to do other things. Maybe I wanted to travel or play video games or live a life differently. For a while I wanted to work in the nonprofit space. I think I'm cured of that now, but that was kind of a goal. So I wanted to have those options. Right? That's really what did it. And one of the things I liked about FIRE is that as you start to build up your wealth, you have what in the community we call FU money. And the idea of FU money is that if you're asked to do something you don't want to do or the job turns toxic in some way, you just tell your boss, F you, and you walk away. And this is always very powerful to people. My experience was different though. Having that FU money, and I would make sure that my manager knew about that, but in a very sort of like subtle, roundabout way. I was not confrontational about it, but what it actually meant for me was that I generally got treated a little better because, of course, if you have to give someone really lousy work, maybe you want to give it to someone who has less flexibility in their work and needs the job more than I do. That's the first thing, right? And the second thing was it meant that I could act in the best interest of the company, my department, my site. I could really do my job. And this improved my performance because I was willing to say the things that everyone else was thinking, but didn't really want to say. In a corporate environment, there's a lot of being silent in the face of ridiculous things sometimes, and I was much more willing to speak up and to fight for something, and I didn't necessarily care what happened. And it turned out that people really appreciate that. And you win a lot of friends and allies, and generally my performance was higher. The more money I had and the more uncaring I was about any future promotions or raises or anything like that, the more of those I got. So that ended up being a very positive experience for me. I also enjoyed the work more because I didn't feel like I was so constrained in what I had to do. I could say what I wanted. In terms of the business side, I wasn't mouthing off about other things. This is about how we were running our business and doing our technology. And I worked for a major semiconductor company, so I worked in high tech.
And was there a specific breaking point or an epiphany moment where you realized this traditional 9 to 5 wasn't going to get you where you wanted to be? What was that point for you?
So I never really had that particular point. I actually liked my job. The advice I give for people is that if you get, the higher paying jobs can be more stress, but usually they're higher paying jobs because you have some skills that are somewhat unique. You have something that can't be easily replaced, whether because you're really good at something or you have a guild or a moat around your profession, like a doctor, for example. It seems hard to become a doctor. So those things give you the flexibility. So my job was never 9 to 5. It was more like 10 to 6 because I worked with California. So I show up at 10 or 11. It's only 7 or 8 a.m. their time. So it's no problem. I did not have to get up early. I had lots of flexibility to work from home. So I never really had that issue with that. I found that I just liked having the options. I was inspired by this idea that you have a bunch of different lives. There's I think it's the Sunday morning breakfast cartoon, SMBC, and there's a particular cartoon where it says you have 11 lives, each of 7 years, and you should go live them differently and not do the same thing for your whole life. And that was inspiring to me, to say, look, much as I like this, I might be really happy doing something else. And what I'm currently doing and being at home, maybe that's just one life of 7 or 10 years, and then I'll switch over to something else. When my kids, in 7 years, my kids will all be 18, and maybe I'll go live in a different way or do something different. So for me, I don't think there's really anything wrong with the 9 to 5. I had never really disliked my job even. So that didn't happen with me, but I know that's a common trope in the FIRE community.
So this was more of a transition rather than a breaking point where you said, I can't take it anymore. I'm going to just retire and to hell with everyone.
No, I loved my job, actually. I really liked it. So, I'm not saying I never had times where things were hard or I disliked it. And certainly in the moment, there were things I didn't like. But, from a big picture perspective, I think high tech is a great field, or at least was a great field.
We often hear about compound interest as the eighth wonder of the world.
Yeah.
I know that Warren Buffett is very much an advocate of compound interest, and it's worked well for him. For someone just starting their FIRE journey, how do you balance the math, trusting the long-term compound growth of your investments with the immediate urge every day to save money, to save every penny to reach that FIRE number faster? How do you balance those two things?
Okay, so here's what I did. So the first thing I did was I got ripped off for a couple of years in a mutual fund. So we had a retirement plan at my work, which meant that they contributed some money and I contributed some money, and they had someone from a bank come and they give you this little form that tells you how much risk you're willing to take. And no matter what you answer, they put you into a pile of garbage. I actually had, I don't know if I've set the record, but I think I was paying over 3% for a few years. And if that's not the world record for the worst investments, that is not a fraud, it should be pretty close, right? And one day I read the piece of it, and I was really realizing that the thing I was in was just buying 4 other funds, and they were charging me 0.8%, and they did no trading the whole year. They just bought these 4 underlying funds, and those funds themselves had a high MER. Similarly, around that time, the site director at my work recommended a book, Stocks for the Long Run by Jeremy Siegel. That's the other book that I showed in the slide earlier. That one he's a prof from the US. And basically, he makes the case that stocks are really good and you should invest in low-cost funds because there's not much evidence that active management, that people can actually make you money. There's some complexity there, but in general, so as I got educated and I realized what I needed to do, I became a stock advocate. I started working in 2000. The stock market crashed about, I don't know, maybe 6 months in or a few months into working. But I didn't really have any money, so that didn't impact me very much. And then the last, say, 25, 26 years, stock market's been mostly everything but up, just up, up, up. And I put money into that. I was a 90% plus stock guy. I think almost all your money, especially when you're young, should be in stocks. The reasoning for that is that most of my wealth, let's say when I was 23 or 25, was locked in my head. It was my ability to draw a salary, and that salary is a little bit like a bond. So if being fully in stock was just rebalancing my portfolio, I was still only 10% stock and 90% bond. And then as you get closer to retirement and you get older and you can't work as much, then you have to maybe try to think if you want your money to be safer. Although I have not changed my allocation. I still try to be 90% plus stocks. So that was the first thing, was getting educated. The second thing was setting goals. So I built a very complex model, way too complex, that just said, here's how much money I want to be working at different times. Here's my plan about when I want to retire. And it looked forward about 40 years. So it was a 40-year plan. And then on in, it was just like probably it's okay. And that helped ground me into what I wanted to do, because for me, having a goal to shoot for was really important. And the third thing I did a little bit later on was being able to translate spending into days or weeks working. Okay, so the general FIRE model is, if you want, let's say, $40,000 every year in retirement, you need $1 million to invest. Okay, and this rule has lots of complexity. We can go into that later, but that's the general idea. So if I'm looking to see, hey, should I spend this $1,000 on something, let's say every year? If I don't spend it, I gain a few advantages. First, I save more money that year. That money then gets invested and grows, and I need $25,000 less in my target retirement amount because I'm never spending that money. So I can then do some math and turn that into how many days or weeks or months of work. So some major purchases that you could do might cost you 6 months of work. And when you put it in that perspective, I say, I gotta now work 6 months longer if I do this thing. That is very, very motivating. Even small things might be like, oh, I want to do this thing, but I think it's going to cost me a full day of work. Then you can decide if it's worth that 8 hours. Now, maybe that 8 hours is in the future, of course, it's not today, but still, I found that very motivating. I'm a big believer in turning all of your decisions into a single dimension, usually some value or cost, that can let you decide between options and whether or not something is really worth the utility. And once I did that, my experience was that most spending wasn't worth it. Another thing I did was I kept my school spending. So when I was in school, I lived on campus with roommates in downtown Toronto. My rent was $425 a month. Okay? This was not a nice place. I don't want to say that, but it wasn't terrible. Well, depends who you ask, but to me, I was definitely livable. I had a very high tolerance for that kind of gross place. And I ate a lot of rice. I got some canned salmon. I didn't really do that much. We would go out for wings at Einstein's sometimes. There was a bar that was called that. But generally speaking, I saved a lot of money, and I didn't adjust for the first 5 or 6 years after I started working. And I think that's a critical thing to do. Once you start adjusting to higher spending, it's hard to go back. So you want to let yourself ratchet your spending up very, very slowly, because it can be very hard to reduce your spending. So by doing that, I was able to save quite a bit of money early, because high tech generally pays quite well in the beginning. I was, even my first year out, I was making 6 figures. This is back in 2000, so it's quite some time ago. And I was able to save a lot. And then that money started to compound. And once you have a big enough nest egg, it can start to materially replace your income.
So you're a very logical person in these spreadsheets. I think most people are not sitting down and drawing up a 40-year plan.
Yeah, that's true.
Like you're very analytical, you would say.
Yes.
I want to ask you about your lifestyle, because I know your lifestyle involves travel, it's involved homeschooling your children. How has being on the road changed the way you teach your children about money and independence? And are there lessons they're learning through travel that they simply couldn't get from a textbook or being in a traditional class?
Okay, so for sure, there's a lot of questions there. Let me start by maybe I'll start by doing just Homeschool 101, because I think that people might not be very aware of that. So I'm going to reshare the screen and just go to my Homeschool 101. Can you see this?
Yes.
Okay, so basically we homeschooled for 4 years and we were COVID homeschoolers. So I'm not an ideological homeschooler. Like I don't necessarily believe that it's better than public schools, although I think it probably is for many people. Nevertheless, I want to go over the different dimensions. So on the far left is the classic homeschooling. This is where you take something like you do in school and you just do it at home. Okay, that's the first one. Then you move to the left, it's more relaxed. So you relax your standards, you relax your hours, you kind of just get through something. Then in the middle is more, you get more eclectic. You do just generally a mix of methods and you let your kids start to push what they want. So if they're interested in learning something, like for example, one of my kids wants to be a forensic scientist, we did some forensic science work. You know, there are high school courses in that in the US, and I used some of their materials. We looked at a couple of research papers together we read through, and that was more interest-led. Then there's a chasm of where basically no one is there, and then you move on and you have unschooling. So unschooling is the philosophy that the kids own their own education, not you. So that fundamentally changes how things go because they have way more control. And I think there's pluses and minuses for all of these things. It's very hard to know whether or not homeschool is better for kids. And my belief is that school or teachers don't make that much difference in the academic outcomes for kids. There's a fair, one of my hobbies is reading research papers. So when it came to finance or education, I read hundreds of papers and dozens of books on these kinds of things. And my conclusion for education is that most of what you do doesn't really matter that much. And if you have that belief, then you can relax about school a little bit, especially before high school. You don't have to worry about it so much as long as you do something, okay? And we went to then there's online school. So online school is totally separate. It's really much more like classic school. You're just sitting in front of your computer. It's not really homeschooling. So during COVID, people called that homeschooling sometimes. That's not generally the term used. And then there's world schooling. So world schooling can encompass any of these methods. Okay? World schooling is just the idea that you do it outside of your house. And there's lots of different ways. So we knew people who just lived somewhere else but did a much more classic type school. And I met lots of people who were unschoolers, who had no fixed address, moved all around, and didn't do anything that resembled classic schooling. And I thought this was a pretty interesting way to do things. And I met these people, by the way, there was a World Schooling Conference. About 250 people went to this conference with lots of kids. It was run by anarchists, so it was a very interesting type system. And I met lots of unschoolers who the kids really fundamentally drove their own education. And in general, I was pretty impressed by them. Most of them seemed, they had good relationship with their parents, they could speak well with people, and they had a plan in life. They had something that they wanted to do, and it was generally not university. Although in one case, someone was learning chemistry and math to go into chemistry in university, but in general, it wasn't. And other than math education, I thought they did very well. So I think kids can succeed in any of these things. Online courses and programs, of course, can always be fit into all of these methods, even unschooling. So you drive your own education, you decide you take an online course, and you do it. Okay. Then there's another group called religious homeschooling. Religious homeschooling is not a group that I know well. So when people think homeschooling, at least in the past, they generally think like Christian homeschoolers, and that is a large group, but I never really met them. As far as I can tell, they're not usually unschoolers. They're usually more like a classic method. All right, and I was here. So we were in the eclectic, wanting to edge a little bit towards unschooling. And this gave us a lot of flexibility when we traveled. Okay, so that's the basics of homeschooling. All right, now let's go back to your question. Let me just make sure I've got that up. No. Okay, so in terms of your question, what we did was we started off as COVID homeschoolers, and COVID happens in March 2020 is when it really starts. I noticed two things with my kids that I think most people do, which is that online school not working. We had two in public school, which is like a disaster. We had two in private school that was a little better, but not really great. Because my kids were young. I had one I think was in senior kindergarten, another was in grade 3, and I just didn't see that an online schooling was ever going to work. And the second thing I noticed was that their fundamental math skills were really weak. And schools seem to have stopped teaching what I think is important for math. That's my favorite subject and my passion, and I just didn't see it. So when we decided to pull them out for a few months during that remainder of the year in COVID, and we used Kumon math and we just started to get them up in the grade levels, and they advanced incredibly quickly, and that went really well. The next year, schools were still closed where we were in Toronto, and we decided to continue homeschooling. And after a while, we started to say, why don't we do some travel while we can? For a while, the world was closed, but pretty soon it started to open up, but yet not many people were traveling. So we tried a trip. I'm a big believer in experimentation. You have this idea of what you want to do, go try it in some way. Usually that's possible, and see how you like it. Maybe you'll hate it. So we did a 2-month trip to Costa Rica and the Galapagos. That was our first big trip, 6 weeks Costa Rica, 2 weeks Galapagos, and it was fantastic. We really, really enjoyed it. We were able to do some schooling, but a lot of the time when we were touring or resting, we just didn't bother, and it didn't feel like we were really missing much. I think that if you're, especially in the earlier grades, if you're just trying to duplicate roughly what the curriculum is, it maybe takes you 3-4 hours a day. That's it, maybe 3 hours. And we weren't even trying to do that. I didn't really care what the Ontario curriculum looked like. I didn't think it was very good. I had my own ideas. I was writing all my own materials by that point. So I don't recommend that, but that's what I was doing. And I was also working during that time. But nevertheless, we had a really, really great time. We said, this is something that we really want to do. We went to the World Schooling Conference that I mentioned earlier. We met a lot of people, saw different kinds of lifestyles. And then we kind of had a decision to make. My usual style was to try to do a little bit of everything. I think that for most people, you'd be better off going all in one way or another. If you're going to world school, then sell it all and start to move around and do that. And there's lots of people who do it. There's also lots of pop-ups that exist. So if you want to, get your feet wet, there's World Schooling pop-ups. Do a search for it, and they run these 7-day places all around the world. There's maybe 20 or 30 per year. We did one in Osaka, Japan. The Galapagos one was another type of pop-up. We did one in Mexico. I took my daughter to one in Seville in Spain, and that was really fun. And you could give it a shot. For us, we decided we would do it for a while, but we would maintain our home base. So we just did a mixture of that. Then I took almost a year off of work, and we did our big trip. So we did 3 months in New Zealand, and then we did Singapore for a couple days. Then we did Thailand, Cambodia, a month in Vietnam. And then we flew to Japan, Vancouver, and then back to Toronto. So it's about 13 weeks or so. And I wasn't working during that time, and it was fantastic. I think everyone loved it. At the same time, by the end, we were ready to go home and rejoin our life. Some of the things I thought they got out of it, like in Vietnam, we were there for a month. When they got up, they could get up in the morning, get on their bikes, or walk to a store and buy some breakfast. Everything was quite inexpensive. You can get a bubble tea for $1. You can get a mini loaf of bread for 20 cents. Or you could even bike, let's say, 2 or 3 kilometers to where there was a tailor who, for not a lot of money, would make you custom clothes, so they could bike there to get measured or to try on something. And we would let them do them on their own. Vietnam is neat in the sense they don't have stop signs. So at least where we were, the streets are all just intersect, and you just have to look and watch. So I think our kids gained a lot of independence that was very, very hard for us to do in other places, especially where we lived in downtown Toronto. It was very hard to give kids that level of independence, and I think they acquired a lot of confidence in that way. I think they became more worldly. They were able to see more of the world. You don't really meet the locals, not in a month. Maybe if we'd been there a couple of years, we could have started to become friends with locals, but it was very hard to do. In Costa Rica, we started to make friends, and we could have made that work. And in Israel, we were there 5 weeks, mostly in Jerusalem, and there we were also starting to make friends. And I could definitely see a path if we had chosen to live there full time. So we were getting there, but mostly you meet other expats. But they are very interesting people with different lifestyles, and one of my kids still has some friends that she talks to that live around the world, and that's been great. So that's been really interesting, and I think they learn a lot from that. The other thing they learn is that you don't have to follow the straight and narrow path, although often I kind of do want my kids to do that. It is kind of what I did, but you learn that there's other alternatives, because for, I think, a large set of people, the classic path, you go to high school, university, you get married, you work, you have kids, in some order like that. It doesn't necessarily work for everyone for a variety of reasons. And it's good to see that there are other options out there that people successfully do that maybe is something that you not even just want to do, but something maybe you need to do. Because I think the modern world doesn't work for some percentage of people, and there are alternatives. You don't need to be stuck. I think there's lots of good options, and I've seen it done by multiple people with all kinds of different skills and backgrounds. So I think that's Yeah, I think that's the main thing that I would say about the homeschool part.
What do they? I'm curious. You said they don't use stop signs in Vietnam.
Yeah,
What do they use instead? How do they navigate that?
nothing. There's just two roads and they just intersect. At
In the
least where
whole,
we were.
at least where you were.
Yeah,
Okay, so they
I'm
just
not saying
intersect.
all. Like, but we were in Hoi An, which is a smaller town. I
Yeah,
think when you go to, we were in the capital for a couple days as we transited to Japan, and yeah, they had traffic lights and so on. They weren't necessarily like strictly followed, I would say, but they did exist. But where we were, there weren't, and there were all sorts of people riding bikes and motorcycles with many people on them. You know, it was a much more relaxed environment, and we liked that.
and people just were careful in the intersections to kind of move around, and there were no accidents and
I
no
didn't.
issues.
I'm sure there are horrendous accidents there, but we didn't see any.
Yeah,
Were they careful? Not as careful as we would be in Toronto. We're very
right,
careful in Toronto.
right. I was going to ask, pursuing fire often requires trade-offs. There's always trade-offs in life.
Yes.
So, what was the hardest comfort or luxury for you to give up in the beginning? And how does the freedom of your current lifestyle, so the ability to travel and homeschool, or as you say, play video games, how does that make the sacrifice feel worth it today?
Yeah. So, if you talk to you listen to most fire communities, you see a few things. They say how bad their upbringing was, and they wanted to escape it. How much sacrifice they had to make. How much they hated their jobs. I didn't really go through that. I will admit. I think that the level of sacrifice I had to get where I was reasonably minimal. The main thing I did was just maintain my lifestyle during university and never let it get ratcheted up to buy expensive things. So at every point, I tried to live in the cheapest place that I could. And that helps a lot. Like rent can be a huge expense. So I went from 425 eventually to about 1,500 a month, which is a little more expensive, but you could easily have spent 2,500 or 3,000. I could have I had a 1 bedroom. I could have had a 3 bedroom or something, and spent a lot more, and that money would be wasted. So I think for me, because I had such a fine-tuned way of looking at whether or not something was worth it, I didn't feel like there was a lot of sacrifice. And video games are extremely cost-effective. So you can buy a video game for, let's say, $50. Maybe you play 100 hours or 200 hours. You're talking, tens of cents per hour of entertainment. There's not much you can do that's cheaper. I had some hobbies that I made money from, like I was a semi-pro poker player. So I went to Vegas a lot, but usually trip after trip, I could pay for my trip at the poker table if I was careful. I also saved money because I couldn't drink while I was playing poker, so I was sober the whole time. And it kept me kind of disciplined while I was there. So those were some hobbies that I had that were useful in terms of cash flow. I made a fair bit of money there. So for me, I think I got fairly lucky. I also didn't really get hit by any major stock market declines because I started kind of just before the major crash in 2000, and so it didn't hit me. 2008 was just a blip. I know people talk about it, but from a stock market perspective, it wasn't that bad. Yeah, there were large drops, but then everything recovered and it just went up from there. So I had the discipline to not sell or do anything at the time. I hardly look at my stock portfolio. So for me, I think that the early savings plus stock market meant I didn't have to do that much in the way of compromising. So no, I didn't do much, but I think it is worth some sacrifice, and I think I would have been willing to do that. And if it comes to the case where there's a stock market crash, let's say in the future, then I'll have to deal with that and probably reduce my spending. And I have a way I can reduce my spending at least 25% if I need to.
Wow. So you have a buffer zone just in case.
Yeah. So every person in the FIRE movement keeps a buffer. Right, so the 4% rule is the standard method that people use to determine it, but no one actually follows that. 4% is just the number that you hit. And there's a tradition in the FIRE movement that as soon as you hit this magic number that's enough to retire, the first thing you do is raise the number. And then you hit that raised number, and then you raise that number again. And then you're like, well, I better also have 2 years of cash just in case, and you raise that number. So that's one level of conservatism. The second way that you do it is that you are willing to cut back your expenses. If you can cut back your expenses enough, it's hard to go broke unless the world really falls apart, and it probably won't. And if it really, really falls apart, your extra money won't help you anyways. So that's the second thing to do. The third thing to do, which I did, which is what's called the sequence of return risk. So the real risk I had when I retired is that, as about 2 years ago, was that the stock market would crash. So it's gone up a lot since I retired. I have a lot more money than when I left. But suppose it had. Suppose it had gone down a lot and kept going down. So maybe, yeah, I wouldn't have had enough money. But I was young enough that I could go back to work. And that's the main thing that people forget. If you save so much that you're so secure, you're probably working too much. And I'll show you an example of what this looks like. I have another slide on that. So this is an example of what's called fire calc, which is something I used. And your risk is running out of money. That's the biggest thing you worry about. So here you start with $1 million. You start spending about $40,000 a year, all indexed to inflation. And then it just tries what would happen if you retired in any 30-year period in history. Okay? So every line is one possible path. This is a very rough kind of approximation. And there are some parts that go below zero. So you can see that sometimes it fails. Can you see my mouse?
Yeah.
So where you see my mouse is where it has failed. And you avoid that by doing a couple things I described. You reduce your spending and you go back to work. But you can see that most of the time, most of the paths are, or many of the paths are well above where you started. In fact, a lot of times you'll have more than triple what you had after inflation, just because the market has done so well. So you have to, when you do FIRE, financial independence, you have to balance those two things. If you're too conservative, you end up retiring too late and you're not really doing the retire early part, and you might have more money than you realistically need. So if you can get there fast enough, you can retire earlier than if you need to, you go back to work, say in the bottom 10 or 20% of cases. So I think that gives me some flexibility. I figure I've got probably 3 to 5 years where I can go back to work and still have a reasonable shot at making a good salary. So that's my plan and some of the sacrifices that I'm ready to make if I need to. Right? That was always part of the plan.
I wonder if you've read a book. You reminded me. There's a book called Die with Zero, and
Yes.
I wonder what you think about that. Here, let me share that. I'm sure you've probably read this.
Yes. I haven't read the book, but I know definitely Die with Zero is a very popular concept.
What is your take on that book, and just tell us a little bit about that.
So I think the idea of Die with Zero is that you work the minimum you have so that you are left with virtually nothing when you die, and the last check you write to the undertaker bounces, right? That's the classic take of it. I don't subscribe to that theory. I have kids. I want to leave them money. I use what's called a capital preservation model. So capital preservation model says, let's say you retire with, let's say $2 million or let's say $5 million, and you earn 4% on that. That's $200,000 a year that you should be able to spend while preserving it. And if the stock market drops and your capital starting to go down, including inflation, then you reduce your spending. But the goal is to leave at least that to your kids. So I don't think dying with zero is a good idea. That is too aggressive for me. I'd be worried about that. It's not just that you die with zero, but you're living with zero for 5 years before that. That means you're spending way too much and you haven't saved enough. So maybe you haven't been, usually also to really plan how your money goes down, you need to be in bonds or other very low performing assets. I just don't see it as being a worthwhile thing if you have kids. If you have no dependents and you don't care about what happens to your money, yeah, then I think that makes more sense. But I have 4 kids and I intend to leave them as much money as I can. And I anticipate, at least based on the last couple of years, that I'll be worth even more money than when I started my retirement. That's my hope.
Because of your investments.
Because of the investments, yeah. The last 2 years have been great. The market's been up enormously. Now, will we have a correction? Yeah, of course. I'm sure. I don't know when, but I'm sure we will. And
right.
Let's see how well I weather a minus 30%.
Let's see. Yeah.
Yeah.
All right. So I wanted to ask you, what do you do once you're actually retired, with your focus on travel? You've done your traveling, you've done your homeschooling, and we talk about the purpose side of retirement. So what does a productive day look like when work is no longer a requirement? What do you do every day? And what's a typical day look like for Terry Borer?
Okay, so first let's talk about the idea of purpose. So I think that's important. My biggest fear for the F5 stuff was pretty non-controversial, right? When you sell it to people, you're like, basically you invest well, you make as much money as you can, and you don't spend a lot of money. That's pretty unobjectionable. Okay, I think it's very hard to disagree with that. The retire early, though, is different. My fears were that I identified a lot with my job. I was the director of a sort of medium-sized high-tech company, the site director in a medium-sized high-tech company in Toronto. I liked my work. I felt like what I was doing was important, and I enjoyed it. I loved working with the people there. So I was worried about losing that. And also I was worried about kind of being adrift and not having any reason to get up in the morning. So at the conference, that world schooling conference I went to, there was one exercise where you had a big circle, at least 50, 60 people in that circle, and everyone says what their fears are of world schooling or retiring early. So I said what my fears were, the purpose and the loss of identity. And anyone who agrees with you is supposed to step forward in the circle, and how much they move is how much they care about it. And basically I said that no one moved. Couple people shuffled forward a little bit, I think just to be nice. And everyone I talked to said, you're crazy to think that matters. And I did notice that no one cared at all what I did for a living. And I don't think they cared while I was working. I don't think they cared after I was working. So my fears, I think, were esoteric and not really, didn't really come true. So I didn't really suffer a loss of purpose. And for me, there's a couple of reasons. First, I had developed hobbies even before I left. Okay, not just travel, but also do a lot of nonprofit work. I'm president of two small nonprofits right now. I do some other volunteer work. And I have 4 kids. Things are really busy. My parents live in town. I'm just not short on things to do. Okay, and everyone I've talked to who's retired has said the same thing. Even people with no hobbies, as far as I can tell, are not bored day to day. It just doesn't seem to happen. You know, my goal was to play 6 hours of computer games a day. I think a reasonable goal for someone who's retired, and I've not been able to hit that. There's just too many other things to do. I haven't even played any computer games today.
What kind of computer games do you play?
So I like the city building role-playing games. So when I retired, I told people I was going to play Baldur's Gate 3, which actually took me a long time to complete. And I just finished up Cyberpunk 2077, which I really liked. That was a big game. And every time I talk to people, it's like, oh, have you seen this game? And I'm like, no, I haven't. So I put that on my wish list. Steam gets it on sale. I buy it for like $20, $30, and I'll go play it. I have a long list of games still to play that I will never get through because more games come out. It's like trying to watch every video on YouTube or watch every show on Netflix. It's just not doable, no matter how committed you are to that. So what I found was a couple benefits that I saw is that if my kids, like a couple days ago, I spent, I don't know, maybe almost 4 hours working on chemistry with one of my kids. And that was okay. When I was working, that would have been exhausting for me because I had a lot of, my number of hours would have been really limited. I was already really tired. I wanted some of my own time. And I might have been a bit grumpy, especially with the needs of all the other people. But because I, had not much to do that day, I was like, okay, no problem. And it didn't hurt me. My parents like me to fix their printer. The printer seems to break an inordinate amount of times and something doesn't print and this thing doesn't work. So I do a lot of tech support with my parents. And I don't mind. I have time on my hands now. It's okay. Or if I need to drive someone, a kid is sick at school, I have to go pick her up or something like that, no problem. Or my wife does it. But I'm much more willing to give of my time, and even if something goes wrong, it doesn't bug me much because I have enough slack. So that's been great. So what do I do in the morning? Well, I get up, I like to have a cup of coffee and maybe read on my phone or sit outside for a while. Today I did the driving, so I did have to get up because I had to go to 10 to 8 we left, and I'm usually, let's say, done all the driving by, say, 9:15 because I've got all 4 kids that I drove today. And today, I prepped a bit and hung out with my wife for a while, but other days I'll come and hit the computer games and I'll play maybe, let's say, do a 3-hour session and then have some lunch or go for a walk.
Are you on a PlayStation, or what platform are you using for that?
Everything on PC. I don't watch any television, and I don't play any console games. I only play the keyboard and mouse combo. That's my style. Usually I'll have some personal work to do, like maybe I'm planning for a trip. Last week was tax time, so I had to do all the taxes, for 6 people. That actually took quite a fair bit of time. It's still complicated for me. I also have my volunteer work that I do that takes up some time. I don't exercise as much as I should, but I do some. I'll go over to my parents' house and hang out with them. I can go. My brother is also retired, so I go downtown and hang out with him. He's a few
Oh,
years older.
your brother's also
He's
done the
also
fire
retired. Yeah,
movement.
I wouldn't say like I quite inspired him, but I think I probably had some factor to do with that for sure. Now
So this seems to run in the family with you guys.
yeah, yeah. Uh,
Um, do you read books? Do you read novels as well?
I do read. So I don't. I have a hobby where I read research papers. So I do a fair bit. So I read mostly nonfiction stuff. I have a couple fiction books that I read here and there, but mostly I read papers and paper analyses. Like there's a bunch
Yeah.
of doctors that I follow that just write about their specialty. I wouldn't say necessarily like it's not in areas where I'm expert, like more the finance or education side. I can follow that, and I know the papers quite well, genetics, and some of the other medical stuff's not my expertise. But I enjoy reading it and seeing what research comes up and taking a look at papers that come out and new randomized controlled trials and stuff like that. That's the kind of reading that I like to do.
I wanted to just jump in and ask you finally, what words of advice or wisdom would you want to share with young people who are just starting out on their career journeys? What advice would you give to those people?
So I think the most important advice I would give is try to figure out what you want in life. I think if you know what you want, it's much easier to get. Okay? That would be the first thing. And not just what you wanted at 15 or 18 or 20, but what you might want more as an adult. So if you kind of look to how your parents have changed over time and what they want, have some faith that you're going to eventually turn into them. You're not just going to look like them as you get older, but you're going to also turn into them, and take that into account as you do your planning. Okay? That's the first thing. The second thing is I believe in front-loading savings. So as much as possible, go to university, make your money, and then have your retirement later. There are models where you goof off in your 20s and then you buckle down later. That could work. I'm not saying that's necessarily wrong, but it's not the kind of thing that I like. So you go to university, try to pick a field that pays well and that you enjoy well enough. Right? Don't just take something randomly that won't lead anywhere, like a liberal arts degree or something like that. Take engineering or pharmacy or forensic science. Become a police officer. Those are kind of things where you have very clear professions that make reasonable money, and you can have as a career and use that as your base. Right?
Or a teacher,
Or a
perhaps.
teacher. Yeah, so teachers, I don't know about in the private system, that I don't know the salaries, but a teacher in Toronto District School Board makes over 100,000 over time, not
Yeah.
the initial salary, plus you get a very rock solid pension. That's a great, from a money perspective and a security perspective, it's very strong. Yeah, it's a good,
Right.
it's a good type of thing. I think those would be some of my, initial advice that I would give. Usually you have to look at what their issues are, because everyone's
Sure.
good at different things.
For sure. Listen, Terry, I really appreciate you taking the time today to speak with me about all of these topics. I want to wish you the very best going forward in your fire lifestyle.
Thank
I'm sure you've got maybe some video games to attend to. So I want to thank you again, and I wish you all the best, Terry.
Thank you. It was fun talking to you. Have
This
a good
was
one,
fun.
Ethan.
All right, have a good one. Thank you.
Bye.